Good evening and welcome to our Finger Lakes 2012 Riesling launch virtual tasting. This is one of a series of virtual tastings we're doing this year for the Riesling launch. We've got some great Rieslings from 2012. We're excited to have you folks listening in and, more importantly, tasting the wine and getting some feedback for us. My name's Jeff Hauk. I'm the winemaker at Lucas Vineyards, and we have with us this evening from Knapp Winery, Steve DeFrancesco, and from Lakewood, Chris Stamp. The first flight, the wines are going to be tasted by these guys and hopefully by you guys also in the order that we gave them to you. We do have a small change in our flights. We have Knapp Dry Riesling 2012 and Lakewood 2012 Dry Riesling in the first flight. We're going to move Lamoreaux Landing Wine Cellars to our second flight, and we're going to have a little break in between the flights, but we're going to get started out. Steve DeFrancesco, he's a longtime winemaker in the Finger Lakes. Steve has a great reputation in the area, and he makes wine both for Knapp Winery and Vineyard and also Glenora Wine Cellars. And so Steve will be represented in both flights this evening. And Steve's going to talk to us about, first off, about his Knapp Dry Riesling from 2012. Steve, you want to tell us a little bit about how you made it,
Sure.
growing season, and then we'll kind of ask you a few questions as we go along.
Okay, Jeff, thanks. This actually, we have two dry Rieslings in Knapp. This one is a special vineyard designate. It's from the estate. It's from block 11, and the vineyard manager and I are pretty close, and we respect each other a lot. And last year we decided to do a trading places thing where I took care of a block of Riesling, and he was going to help out in the cellar. He still owes me some work in the cellar, but I went out and did all the canopy management on a particular block of Riesling, and I realized how much work it is to get the shoots positioned if you're not, if your timing isn't good, because too early and it isn't going to go where you want it, and the shoots are going to break off, and too late, and you've got a jungle, and it's a lot of work. And I also did it on my own time too, so. I really appreciate how much work is involved out in the vineyard doing that, getting that canopy opened up. So this particular block we picked separately, vinified separately, and we made it a little drier than our dry Riesling normally is too. So, so we call this the KV Estate Riesling. It's 0.5% sugar and about, and not about, but 0.79% total acidity, so well into the dry range. And we only made 182 cases of this one out of our 11,000 cases of production. And our normal dry Riesling label, we do about 400 cases, so this is very much a limited edition.
What was the suggested retail price on that?
This is $18.95.
Great. And we had a question about that vineyard, how old that vineyard was.
This was put in 06, so it's about 7 years. And we had older Riesling that went way back, but there was that freeze of 04 and 05 that really wiped out a whole bunch of things. And surprisingly, Lemberger, not surprisingly that Lemberger made it through, but Sangiovese made it through that too that winter, but not that it had any crop. But some of our older vineyards didn't make it through very well, so we replanted.
In the 2012 growing season, just in general, as far as Riesling went, like what were your observations, challenges that you guys had?
Well, it was a really warm year, and usually we think of the east side of the lakes as being a little bit warmer. They are because they get the afternoon sun. But in these warmer years, the west sides of the lakes, I think, retain the acidity and the fruitiness a little bit better. And sometimes, excuse me, we some of the earlier picked Rieslings, because between the two wineries we deal with 7 or 8 different grape growers for Riesling, and in the warmer years, sometimes the earlier picked Rieslings are have more crispness certainly, but retain their fruit a little bit better too. So it's nice to be able to work with multiple growers and be able to put those pieces together like we were doing.
That kind of fits in, Steve, to the next question I was going to ask you. We had one of our media members had asked about microclimates within your vineyards and how they might affect their tasting this evening.
Yep.
So would you like to just comment on that?
Sure. For one thing, microclimate is the area within the canopy, not where the land is. That would be more of a mesoclimate. But I think the Finger Lakes, with different soil types and sun angles, does have a lot of unique things that can be brought out in wine if you're careful with it.
Great. Trellising method, we were going to touch on a little bit on what method you guys use in Knapp.
In Knapp we use a modified Scott Henry, and with that we train, it's a divided canopy up and down with a gap in between. So we do the upper canopy has catch wires that hold the shoots up, and then the modified part of the Scott Henry is that we allow the bottom canopy to droop down on its own, and that devigorizes the shoots a little bit, enough to we get plenty of leaves, but not so much vigor. And having that gap opened up where the fruiting zone is lets the clusters dry out from the dew, or lets the sun in there. So it's a neat way.
And also, Steve, you were with that training system. They had asked about leaf thinning, so it almost isn't as necessary with that training system.
It's not as critical, I don't think, but a little bit of leaf blowing, I think. Last year, even as warm and dry as it was, we did have some detritus at the end, and some careful leaf blowing was helpful.
All right. Well, any of you media members following along with our virtual tasting, if you have any questions specifically for Steve, I definitely will go back to him if they come across after we move on to Chris. Chris won't mind if we go back and let Steve answer a question or two. So they're pretty good friends. So it all works. Next up, we have Chris Stamp, owner, winemaker at Lakewood Vineyards, just down the road from where we are this evening at Glenora. And Chris, like Steve, has been making wine in the Finger Lakes for a number of years. He's about my age, so it must be he's been around for a long time. So he's does a great job, has a great reputation. They make outstanding Rieslings, also some vinifera reds, and a variety of other styles of wines also. And Chris is pouring this evening his 2012 dry Riesling. And Chris, I'd kind of ask you to kind of take us through a lot of the same types of things that we asked from Steve, how you made the wine, some challenges you had during that growing season. And of course, the media always likes to know about the suggested retail price of that one.
I can start with the suggested retail price. It's $12.99 a bottle.
Great.
Our dry Riesling from 2012, I think probably 2012 was one of the least challenging years for a winemaker. My brother's our vineyardist, and he grew all the grapes for this. We have 6 different Riesling blocks on the farm, planted at different times. The 2012 is a blend of 3 different blocks of Riesling, 2 different clones. It's a 239 and a 198. And the oldest vineyard there is about 20 years old. And Steve mentioned the freeze of 04, 05 that winter, which was tough on a lot of vinifera. Fortunately, well, we didn't get a crop really to speak of in 05. I put it in one small tank. We were able to bring the vines back up from above the graft and restore the vineyard. This is about 2/3 from 20-year-old vines and 1/3 from 7-year-old vines. They're all on Scott Henry. The only difference between our Scott Henry and your Scott Henry is that we use catch wires on the lower, so not the modified Scott Henry. But it basically, like Steve said, it spreads the vines up and down, parting them kind of like you part your hair in the middle, leaving this open zone with the fruit hanging out there so it can dry off and get sun on it. And the real advantage is that you also aren't really taking off a lot of leaves because you move them up and down, and the leaves will you keep them on because they're helping you ripen the fruit, but you have this huge wall of leaves all the way from about 10 feet up all the way down, and so you have all these little solar collectors helping ripen your fruit, and it works very well. We didn't use back a long time ago. You know, we were all learning different trellis systems, and we went from the way you used to grow labruscas around here 20 years ago when we started planting Rieslings, and we all just kind of did the same thing, and then we discovered vertical shoot position, low cordon, and then we kind of graduated to Scott Henry and modifications of that, and it's improved the quality of the fruit. And it helps on perfect years like 2012 where you really don't have a lot of disease pressure, and it's even more pronounced benefits on cooler or wetter years like what we're experiencing this year even. The Rieslings still look fantastic. 20
Chris,
years ago they looked terrible.
Talking about the rainy year that we've had some rain this year, one of the media members had asked about what kind of rainfall we get in the summertime in the Finger Lakes. You want to just comment on that? It changes every year.
Yeah, and it does. If you compare this year to last year, for instance, the worst rains that we get are the ones that come the later part of August through September, and because a lot of varieties are sucking up the water really fast at that point, and some varieties are prone to splitting, not Riesling, fortunately. This year, we had a significant amount of rain this year. Fortunately, our growers are a lot better than they used to be. And I'm talking about my brother and a number of other growers that grow for us around the Finger Lakes. They've managed to keep the fruit very clean this year. And I'm excited about the 2013 harvest, but it's always tough getting into a harvest like the current vintage 2013 after you come off one of those walk in the park vintages like 2012 where the wines just shine so naturally on their own, but on 2013 guys like Steve and me, we have to earn our living.
Definitely. You talked about your Scott Henry, and you said that you guys really don't need to do much leaf pulling. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the Scott Henry kind of takes care of that.
Takes care of it.
We do walk through them one time, and if you find that there's areas where maybe the leaves still are shading the fruit, we like a little shade on the fruit. We've learned that you can overexpose the fruit too, especially if you end up with a really hot spell in August and some good hard sunshine. You can sunburn the berries, and it's not the best thing. So we leave a certain amount of leaves still in the fruit zone to kind of offer a little bit of shade to the fruit.
Again, folks are interested in variation from vineyard to vineyard and even within your vineyards. Are you and Dave, are you tasting differences in your fruit in those different blocks and then finding that the wines are different afterwards? And also like fruit that you guys are buying from other people that you see the same thing?
There's absolutely no question about it. We keep every single grower and block of Riesling separate when we press it and all the way through fermentation, and it's not until like this blend here, it's from 3 different blocks of ours. We go through and taste all the different tanks, and some of them lend themselves more toward our dry Riesling, and some of them lend themselves more toward our sweet Riesling. And but there are certain vineyards that consistently play into the dry Riesling, and those are the ones that I find the fruit is the sweet tree fruit aromas and flavors are a little more subtle than they are in our sweet Riesling blend. But they tend to show more lime peel and and I guess what people would call minerality. I'm not really sure I know what that term means, but it is kind of a wet, slaty nuance that it gives to it, and it usually is more citrus fruits. And we tend to use those for our dry Riesling more because our sweet Riesling has this big peach pear aroma to it, and it makes you expect to get sweetness on your palate because our brains interpret those aromas that way. And so to get more harmony in the wine, I always use those in our sweeter wine with the more citrusy varieties or vineyard blocks go toward our dry. And those tend to be ones with a little bit more clay. Of course, we've got a couple different clones too, which also play a role in the flavors that you get out of them.
And then, is there like a certain yeast that you like to use for Riesling, or do you like to experiment too with different?
Well, I've been
yeast?
doing this for 30 years, and some of my experimentations have yielded results, and you settle on a yeast. And at some point, you got to say, you know what, I really found a yeast I'm happy with, and it becomes a style-consistent component. So we have settled on a yeast. I use a Cote de Blanc or Epernay 2 yeast for all of our Riesling now. I like it the best consistently year in and year out, and we stuff with it now.
Very good. And what's the production for Lakewood for Riesling? And then they also just wanted to know what the production of your winery was in general.
We do about 32,000 cases altogether. It translates to somewhere around 80,000 gallons. Because winemakers actually.
So for folks who are following in, they may. In the world of wine, it's not huge, but in the Finger Lakes, that's on the larger side. So for some of you maybe who are from California, we're probably small, but that's for the Finger Lakes, Lakewood, Glenora, Knapp, they would all be on the larger side in the area.
Mm-hmm. Well,
anything else that Chris you'd like to add about Finger Lakes Riesling in general, or just your specific wine that people are tasting this evening?
I'm particularly pleased with the 2012. I guess I would say stylistically, we evolved slightly in 12. We used a little more of our tree fruit sweetie type of Riesling in it to give it a little less of the citrus forward and a little more peach and pear in the aromas. It's after going back and forth and tasting a lot of my favorite Finger Lakes Rieslings, I see that was kind of a trend, but I still wanted to stay consistent with what we've been doing. We added just a little more of, that was actually what we call the wedge block. It's a kind of triangle-shaped vineyard and gets its name that way. We used a little more of that fruit in this wine just to give it a little more of the peach pear component, but not too much. We like it to smell and taste dry, and this is right in the IFR. Is this IFR? Yeah. IRF. Yeah. IRF dry category.
And if anybody is listening along, they're not familiar, it's the International Riesling Foundation, and what we are doing in the Finger Lakes and a number of other Riesling producing regions is using a sliding scale to help consumers so they can glance at the bottle and know if the wine is going to taste dry or taste sweet. And are you guys yes. both using that? And a lot of the top Finger Lakes producers are using that. We had another question for you guys about Riesling clones. If our clones in the Finger Lakes are Germanic in origin, and I'm not really positive, like clone 90, 198. Do either one of you know the origins of those clones? I'm not really sure.
I'm not sure either. We use 239 quite a bit. But, I think the older clones are like 90.
Yeah, we've got our 90, oldest Riesling vineyard is 90.
I think our oldest one is 90 too.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure where it came.
But I can't give you an educated answer.
I know some people, the older plantings, some came from Constantine Frank, and I'm really not sure what the origin of those vines was. Well, we're going to wrap up our first panel, and we're going to take a break for a couple of moments, and then we'll come back with our second panel. Steve will be joining us again for our second panel. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back. We're lined up for our second flight of the evening. Again, for those of you who maybe just joined our feed this evening, we changed the order, and we do have, in our second flight, we have Lamoreaux Landing Wine Cellars, Red Oak Vineyard Riesling, Lucas Vineyards Semi-Dry Riesling, and Glenora Wine Cellars Riesling. And we're going to go through those three wines, and I'm going to ask the winemakers and owners to tell us a little bit about those wines. And first up, we have Mark Wagner from Lamoreaux Landing Wine Cellars. Lamoreaux, one of the most picturesque wineries in the Finger Lakes. It really is like kind of an iconic building that like catches people's eye. Mark has done a great job with the winery, and the wines also are outstanding. They speak for themselves, and he's very well known in the region, and also a very hands-on owner and very involved in the winemaking also. And Mark is going to take us through and tell us a little bit about the Red Oak Riesling from 2012, and then we'll ask him some questions as we go along. We'd love to get a little interaction from some of our media members, so hopefully we can get some questions thrown back to you. Mark, could you start out telling us the suggested retail price of that wine?
Well, Red Oak Riesling is suggested retail of $19.99.
And then you just want to take us through, tell us a little bit about that wine and the growing season.
Yeah, the Red Oak Vineyard Riesling is one of our single vineyard series Rieslings. We do 3 single vineyard wines, and they're interesting because they're all the same clone of Riesling, and they're grown on 3 different properties. All 3 vineyards were planted identically. And they're managed identically with the Scott Henry trellising system, but they're different. They all taste a little bit different, and the major part of that is just because of the soil they're in. So the single vineyard Rieslings really show exactly what can happen when you have just different soils. And 2 of these vineyards are just across the street from each other, but it's enough different that they actually have the wines taste different.
So for folks who aren't familiar with the region, like why would we have soils different right across the street from each other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in the Finger Lakes, the soils are all glacial till, meaning that whatever the glaciers, when they receded 10,000 years ago, dropped, is what our soils are. So even within the same field, the soils can vary to what type they are. All of our soils that we're growing on are gravelly silt loams, but they're categorized a little bit different. And then the subsoil can be different underneath what the topsoil is, so that makes a difference as well.
So 2012, like just for folks coming in, for you guys at Lamoreaux, what was the growing season like? And how did it affect how this wine turned out?
Yeah. 2012 was kind of an ideal growing season. It was it's probably the easiest season that I can remember living through. And I've been doing this for longer than I want to say. But the wines, the grapes generally came in with fairly low acids and quite high sugars. So consequently, the final wines are a little bit lower in acid. And that is nice in a lot of ways, but it means that a lot of our wines are finished actually drier than they might have been had the acids been higher, because the sugars typically balance out the acid, and even in a dry wine there's quite often a little bit of residual sugar in it, particularly Riesling. The Red Oak Vineyard Riesling is the total acidity, the TA at the end of fermentation, is 6.41 grams per liter. So it's pretty low. The pH is 2.99. Well, that's kind of unusual too. It's pretty low pH for such a low TA. And the residual sugar in it, as we call it, medium dry, because we use the International Riesling Foundation's scale on our bottle, and we usually don't talk about what the sugar is, because the International Riesling Foundation gives you a scale that is based on the pH, the total acidity, and the sugar, which is really much more representative of what you perceive as the sweetness of the wine.
We had a question, Mark, just kind of a general, what trellis system do you use for Riesling? And are you, do you enjoy doing a leaf thinning with Riesling? Is that business as usual with the variety?
I've never enjoyed Denley. But we do Scott Henry trellising system. And in a Scott Henry trellising system, the canopy is divided. There's a fruiting zone kind of in the middle of the trellis, and then there's growth going upward and growth going down to the ground. One of the big advantages that I see in our vineyards is that we have 8 feet of trellis and 8 feet of height of leaves on our trellis. So we're really maximizing the ability for the vine to utilize the sun that the vine gets hit by, which translates into what I think of as really high quality fruit. We generally don't do much leaf thinning. We do a little bit of hand leaf thinning in the vines, but pretty minimally, because most of the fruit is pretty well exposed, except for maybe in the center of the vine in this trellising system, and that's generally where we pull some of the leaves. But we try to pull as few leaves as possible. I always think of the leaves as the manufacturing part of the grapevine, and taking them off seems counterproductive to me. And I think there's reasons to do it and reasons not to do it. So we try to do as little as possible and still have good exposure to the fruit and airflow through the trellis.
Is there anything like unique, Mark, with regards to when you get the fruit into the winery that you guys do with your Riesling? Any particular house yeast or style that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, we use more than one yeast. We do use commercial yeast strains. We don't do natural yeast. I'm tend to think that natural yeast are great, and if they're the right natural yeast, and if they're the wrong one, then you destroy your wine. So we really prefer to try to use a commercial strain that we know what it's going to do to the wine. And is there a favorite of mine? I don't know if I'd say that. I know we always are trying new ones. Every year we do a small batch with something, or maybe a couple different yeasts just to try them out and see how they work. The one thing that I would say about yeast is that oftentimes 5 years later down the road, if you put one yeast against another and it's the same wine, same juice from the same grapes, well, early on those yeasts may actually give you some distinct differences. Usually later on, as the wine ages, differences disappear over time.
That's definitely a good point, I think. And we did have a question that someone had asked about the native yeast, and so far it seems like our winemaking panels, I guess I'd have to include myself in that, are also using commercial yeast strains. So we had a question, Mark, and I'll throw it out to you, and Steve and I could comment on it too. Like, someone had asked about their impression was that most Finger Lakes vineyards were single vineyard Rieslings.
That's an interesting question, but I think that probably isn't true. Most Rieslings are probably blends from several different vineyards, and for example, on our property we have 5 different Riesling blocks, and our dry Riesling and our semi-dry Rieslings will be a blend of all of those vineyards generally. But the single vineyards will take just specifically from one block and only from that block to get the wine, that bottle in.
Very good. Anything else tonight, Mark, you'd like to add about Finger Lakes Riesling in general, or Lamoreaux Landing? They also were interested in what your production was of Riesling and the production of Lamoreaux in general.
We do about 100 tons of Riesling a year, which translates into a bit over 6,000 cases. We have about 105 acres of vineyard at Lamoreaux, and Riesling is our biggest variety. We have about 30 acres of Riesling now. What else did you ask?
Just the production overall.
Oh, the overall
your-
production, yeah. We do about 13,000 cases
Great.
and growing.
That is awesome. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And if we have any questions that come in related specifically to the red oak, we'll kick it right back to you. And next up this evening, I'm going to jump behind the table and talk for a minute about the Lucas Vineyards 2012 semi-dry Riesling. Bear with me. So I switch hats and put on my winemaker hat for a moment. 2012, like a lot of the other panelists, for Lucas, very similar. It was a great growing season, beautiful, pristine fruit to work with. We had a pretty good idea as summer was going along that it was going to be nice, and then it never stopped for us. We had some nice heat in August, and the fruit was just gorgeous. For me, tasting the wine a few minutes before we started a virtual tasting, I got lots of bright, ripe fruit, both in the nose, some nice Riesling aromatics, and then I thought it came through with some nice ripe fruit on the palate also. And again, like Chris Stamp said, we should be able to get some ripe fruit on our Riesling in a year like 2012, because if we can't do it in a year like that, then we're not doing our job. At Lucas, our training system, a little different than our other panelists, probably back a little old school for me. We still use vertical shoot positioning. And the difference between that and Mark and Steve's training systems is we're training both sides vertically. And because we're using that system, we do get some congestion in the fruit zone. So we do some leaf pulling on one side of the vine. And that's to increase airflow and also bring some sunlight into the canopy. But we are always mindful of not taking too many leaves away, as I agree with Mark that we need those leaves to ripen up the fruit. And also we're concerned in a hot year like 2012 with trying to not get sunburn on the fruit. And we're so some leaf pulling and vertical shoot positioning. In the winery, what we're doing, we're bringing the fruit in. It's all hand-picked fruit. We use crews, try and pick early in the morning and pick up the fruit as quickly as possible, get it into the winery. It's fairly traditional. The wine is crushed and destemmed. We press and cold settle, and then we use a commercial yeast like Chris Stamp. I've been using Epernay 2 is my favorite yeast for Riesling, but we have done some trials the last couple of years trying to see if, like Chris, if I find something I enjoy and I'm looking for a consistent style, I'm not going to change it unless I find something that I like better. 2012, we had a question about botrytis in that wine, very small amount. Botrytis wasn't real prevalent in 2012, and in our vineyards it wasn't very prevalent either. This, it's interesting, we're a fairly small farm, especially compared to the guys on my right and left. Lucas only has 32 acres of grapes. We do purchase some fruit, but our Riesling is all from our own estate. We have about 5 acres of Riesling, and that's from 3 different blocks. One block is about 33 years old now, and which for the Finger Lakes is actually a pretty old planting. And this wine is a blend of that with another block that was planted in 1997. And what we usually do is I'll ferment the wine separately and then do trials. And but what we have found is that there are certain blocks that we get more tree fruit aromas and flavors, and we're more likely to use those in our sweeter style Riesling, which this one is. And then our dry Riesling, I'm looking for one. We have a part of our older block which gets much more citrus fruit, and again, it smells dry to me, and the fruit tastes more like it has that character that I'm looking for in the dry Riesling. So the suggested retail price of that wine is $13.99. Challenges in the growing season. Challenge for me, not necessarily specific to Riesling, but it was trying to pick like 10 varieties of wine in 2 weeks, because in a lot of years, our challenge is to slowly have patience and wait for the grapes to get ripe. And in 2012, it was more, let's get the grapes in, they're beautiful. And so that was a challenge for us, but not one that we would mind having to face again. Microclimates, again, with a small farm like ours, we still find differences. If I brought you folks out to our 3 different Riesling blocks, the fruit tastes decidedly different in those 3 blocks. The clones are different, but I still feel that it's the differences in the soil and the location that's changing the flavor. And again, like in the winery, the yeast can affect that, but I tend to agree with Mark. When the wines are young, you get fruity, estery aromas from the yeast, and then over time that goes away, and it's more like what the vineyard kicked out will show more with some time. And the other thing that I love about Finger Lakes Riesling, whether it's Steve's or Mark's or my own, I love them when they're young. They're bright, fresh, and fruity. They're inviting. And when you talk about the wine 4 or 5 years later, they're really interesting. They develop complexity. They bring on some different aromas, and they actually just make a completely different wine with a little bottle age. So for folks, we find a lot of customers like that fresh and fruity flavors, but these wines can be very beautiful with some age on them. So it is something that people can put in their cellar for a while, and they'll definitely be rewarded. We actually have found for us, when we've gone back through and done vertical tastings, that we actually like some of the cooler years for aging the wines. Some of the hotter years, the wines don't tend to age as elegantly as the cooler years. And I think for Lucas, unless we get any other questions in there, Steph. Again, we had a question regarding the clones, and I'm going to ask Mark, because before you showed up, Mark, we had a question about the clones. At Lucas, we have some 90, 198, and 239, and I don't know the origin of those clones. Do you know the origin of any of them, Mark?
Europe.
But he had asked specifically if they were from Germany, and I'm not really sure, but
I would guess that's where they're coming from, but I don't know.
And production for Lucas Riesling in general is between 1,500 and 2,000 cases, fairly small as far as the production of Riesling. And for the winery itself, it's about 25,000 cases. And I'm going to jump back over and let Steve put on his Glenora hat next. And Steve's going to talk a little bit about his 2012 Glenora Riesling. And Steve, you know the drill. You're going to take us through and tell us all about it.
Thanks, Jeff.
And hopefully we'll get a few questions for you too.
Very good. Thank you. This is the Glenora Dry Riesling, $13.99 for our retail price in our retail shop, and we make about 2,600 cases of this dry Riesling and about 51,000 cases overall. This one is a blend of 2 vineyards that are.
This one, Steve, isn't the dry, right?
This is a semi-dry.
Semi-dry.
This
right.
we're doing a semi-dry. I might have said dry. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
No.
I just
This
wanted
is
to make
a
sure.
semi-dry. We're doing 2,600 cases. But Riesling is our biggest variety. We do probably 20,000 cases altogether of Riesling. And we work with 6 or 7 different growers. I should have counted them before I came in. I certainly spent time in all of them. And we get them from the east side and the west side of Seneca Lake and the west side of Cayuga Lake. Mostly from the east side of Seneca Lake, the side that we can see. But this is a blend of two vineyards that are pretty good size, that are close to each other but on each side of the lake. So the Ryan William Vineyard and the Glenora Farms Vineyard, which used to be Spring Ledge Farms, not actually part of Glenora Wine Cellars, even though it's called Glenora Farms. Very good grape grower who is pretty meticulous, as well as the Ryan William. Right across the lake from each other, they can see each other, but one's a little bit farther south. The Ryan William is 239. The Glenora Farms has about 8 blocks of Riesling, and some go back to the 1970s. And some are as recent as like 6 or 7 years old, in different places and different row orientations. I think we get tangerines from the west side from Glenora Farms and apricots from the east side. It's a nice
Sounds like
blend.
a good blend.
Yeah, it works out pretty nicely. As Mark was saying, 2012 was a low acid year, yet the pHs were low too, so you couldn't really add acid and knock that pH down further, so we needed to leave less sugar. That made the alcohols a little bit higher too in the 12. So we're looking at 12.5% alcohol in our Rieslings, when usually we're around 11. We use mostly Epernay 2 yeast. We have played around with, in 1999 I did a lot of gallons of uninoculated fermentations, and in 2011 we had one that took off on us and actually kept tasting good, so we kept letting it go. We let it go, and we bottled it on its own, and we called it Wild Yeast Riesling. So it's not like if it seems like we're
This is a good question I've heard
Yes.
come up before about
Yeah.
that, Steve. Now,
yes.
did you guys ever check the have it plated or something, to, because it's always been said, like, if you had a winery that used, like, you used a lot
Yeah.
of Epernay too.
Yeah. Mhm.
So are you sure it wasn't Epernay too?
Well, I think that it tends to taste, when we do let them go on their own, they
Yep.
tend to taste similar to what we've already had. So, but from
Makes
what I
sense.
understand, there's they're learning a lot about yeast populations now, and this will probably bore everybody to death. But there are hardly any yeasts, Saccharomyces yeasts, that come in from the vineyard, and yet a few days after fermentation has started, it's dominated by them. So how they do that, it's pretty amazing. And actually, by genetic fingerprinting, they're seeing how yeasts have evolved from different sort of tribes that go way back to probably the Mesopotamians for their here and stuff. Anyway, sorry about all that.
Hey,
Digression, but
someone asked.
It's a fascinating thing, so, how yeasts have evolved along with humans, and that seems to be a correlation, definite correlation.
I'm going to ask you, Steve, because it's a question one of our media people had gave us, and we haven't touched base on it. What are you feeling about climate change with regards to Riesling in the Finger Lakes?
Well, I think that it's pretty obvious that either the reporting on the 24-hour news and the Weather Channel, that there's some pretty dramatic weather that happens that I don't remember when I was little. And I didn't live here, I lived in Florida, but I remember the flood of 1972 in the news. It was in New York. And in 2011, there was a worse one in Binghamton. And we hardly, I mean, it's a big deal, but there's floods all the time now, and there's really dramatic weather, and tornadoes where you didn't used to see them. So I think that you might say, oh, great, we're going to be like the Napa Valley because it's going to be warmer. I don't see the good things, and I'm not a pessimistic person, but I see more challenges in east of the Rockies, where we have more moisture than we want most of the time, and we get lots and lots of rain, but it's not necessarily like we had 2 inches of rain in September. We had 2 inches of rain on September 12th, so and it could be drought on either side of that. So it definitely brings.
One of the
Because
questions
we
people
didn't get 2 inches
Yeah,
of
people
rain.
had asked about the rain, and I thought maybe they would be leading into like, are the vines irrigated in the
Mhm.
Finger Lakes? There are some, but
Yeah.
would you guys say that the majority are not?
No,
No.
yeah.
There
And
is,
they don't have to be, and they can still live and produce crops. But it would be nice during those drought periods if we
to
were,
be able to have.
if we had water when we wanted it, for the roots, not for the rest of the vine.
The weather thing is pretty interesting though, because we have had these dramatic storms that roll through, but they're kind of localized.
Yeah.
So that it may, even though you're only 5 miles
Yeah.
south of where
Yes.
my farm is, on the other side of the lake, you can have 2 or 3 inches more rain than I
Yeah.
get at any certain day.
Yeah, it. I don't think it used to be that way.
I don't either. I mean,
Yes.
we're not really in an excess situation,
Mhm.
but there are places in the Finger Lakes that are.
And I think like the Mark and Steve have been around the region longer than I have, but even in the time I've been here, like you've just seen some small changes that definitely not something that I think any of us are excited about. We love Finger Lakes Riesling, and we don't really want it to change very
Right.
much.
It's,
So
it's working the way it has been.
yeah, it works.
Yeah.
So anything else, Steve, with regards to that wine you'd like to talk to us about? The one thing I didn't touch base on tonight, and I can go back and ask the three of us since I can't ask Chris now, but distribution. People are always, especially the media members who are writing about it, are always interested in where people can find the wine. Glenora, where are you guys distributed, Steve?
We're very well distributed in New York State, north of Westchester. Very well distributed. We have a good wholesaler. Other than that, we're available with internet sales in many states, and we have worked on opening up our markets outside of New York over the years. We've gone to Ohio and Vermont and Illinois, and it's hard to support those markets aggressively when you're far away. So we're happy to say our wine is available to many consumers in this country, but not necessarily at their local wine shop.
Okay.
If
Is
they're outside
would
of
you
New York.
guys be in a similar situation, Mark?
Well, we're upstate New York. I mean, yeah,
Mhm.
north of Westchester, definitely
Mhm.
very well distributed, and more so down in the metro area, around the city, and a little bit around Boston, and we do some in Pennsylvania, and Virginia, but done internet sales. We any place it's legal to ship, we can ship. And so that's the way we get further out away from the wineries, by shipping UPS more than anything else.
And I should have mentioned that we do have a distributor in New York City, and they're very enthusiastic about Finger Lakes wines in general. So that's
Especially
been
Riesling.
changing. Yes, yes.
And for Lucas, also upstate New York, some in Metro, and we're starting to see a little bit more movement in the New York City area. And then online, our wines are pretty widely available in a number of states. We do have a distributor in Florida and a distributor in Vermont. And anything else you guys would like to add to our Riesling discussion before we wrap things up for the night? I just want to thank Steve and Mark, and definitely want to thank all of our media members for taking the time to taste some of our 2012 Rieslings. We're all excited about it. We hope you enjoyed the wines tonight, and we'll look forward to hearing back some feedback from you folks. And thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you for our next virtual tasting.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks.